So my thoughts about this journey through the London Plan, and my apologies, these kind of documents can be a bit wordy, so I will strive to inject some energy across the internet. It's much harder to do on these calls than it is when you're in the same room, but I thought there'd be three sections to this talk. The first one is, what is the London Plan? Now, some of you I'm sure are familiar with it, but many of you may not be. And the second one, and a little bit of this starts to be my personal opinion. I suspect it's an opinion that may be shared with some members of the audience, but I should just point out it's my opinion, some of this, and not necessarily that of CIBSE's. But my second point is, why in its current form is the London Plan problematic for the lift industry? And then the third and final point is what do I think we can do as an industry to resolve some of these problematic issues? So the first point then, what is the London Plan? Now, a lot of these slides you'll see have got italic content on them in inverted commas. So when you see that on these slides, these are direct extracts from the document that's referenced. So this is a direct extract from the London Plan and sets out what it's all about. And it talks about the fact that the London Plan is related to legislation. Yeah, and it requires the Greater London Authority to publish a development strategy. And this development strategy is known as the London Plan. And it's a strategic plan for London. And it sets out an idea for an integrated way of developing the city over the next 20 to 25 years. And I guess there's a number of you that might be sitting there thinking, well, I don't work in London, or I don't live in London. So, you know, what's the point of this? And I guess it's that trend that one sees in these kind of design guidance documents that others look at them and think that's a good idea, we should adopt that. So certainly I think in the UK there's a sense that the London Plan at the moment may only apply to London, but many of the big urban metropolises may look at this and may start to adopt similar. And certainly from my perspective, whilst I'm going to talk about some of the problems I perceive with the London Plan, I think its intent is fantastic. And it offers a great opportunity and is heading in exactly the right direction. So what else is the London Plan? Well, as it said earlier, it's legal. It does sit within a legal framework, and each of London's local planning authorities have to have a development plan, and part of that is the London Plan. And it needs to be taken into account whenever planning decisions are taken in any part of Greater London. So this is a document that relates to planning. It's not a safety standard. It's not a code of practice. It's a document that provides guidance to the process of planning decisions within Greater London. And it talks about planning applications should be determined in accordance with it. Now, I may be reading more into that word than should be, but certainly in my experience with lift standards, when you use the word should, you're recommending. So they're saying it should be, not must be, but should be. But it does tend in that second paragraph there to say, unless there are sound planning reasons would indicate otherwise. So it's kind of suggesting that this is a document, an important legal document that sets out guidance that should be used in determining planning applications. Obviously, we said it applies in Greater London, but the sense is that it may be adopted as best practice by other local authorities in time. And I think there's key words in there that says its requirements must be taken into account as part of the planning decision, and the planning decision should require compliance. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not a design or safety standard. And as such, in my opinion, it shouldn't be a document that's referenced by the fire service or building control, you know, in the same way that approved document B might be, or approved document M as guidance documents to compliance with legislation. You know, this is a planning type document. But having said that, I think that there's a sense forming, and we're starting to see examples where building control and the fire brigade look for facilities that are also required by the London Plan, because as to take a different position might be a bit difficult for them, and the London Plan is being perceived as the right thing to do, and why wouldn't one? So it all sounds good. Yeah, it's a good piece of guidance. You know, what's the problem? Why do we think it's worthy of discussion in the lift industry? What's causing the problems? In the document, there's a foreword by the Mayor, Sadiq, pictured here on the right. And the extract on the left-hand side talks about this rigorous process of consultation. Yeah, 300 different organisations and individuals participating. And the London Plan has genuinely been informed and influenced by the engagement of all these 300 different organisations. I think the problem when you look at the lift industry is we're all kind of going, consultation? Well, what consultation? And certainly from my perspective, and I know a number of others on the call's perspective, this kind of appeared out of the blue, and we really didn't know about it. And we certainly hadn't contributed any kind of consultation. And we'll talk a little bit more maybe about the importance of commenting on documents, but it certainly appeared out of the blue. And why should we be concerned about it then? Well, if we start to dig into the detail of what the London Plan says, so it's a big document, it's hundreds of pages long, but this policy D5, is where it starts to get relevant to the lift industry. So this piece talks about inclusive design and is kind of a foundation of what the London Plan is trying to achieve. So as you can see the highlighted words on the right, so it's all about trying to achieve the highest standards of accessible and inclusive design. And the second point is highlighted there is it's aimed at incorporating safe and dignified emergency evacuation for all building users in all instances. And then it starts to talk about things that start to generate some issues for us as an industry, I believe. It says where lifts are installed in a building, as a minimum, at least one lift per core or more subject to capacity assessments should be a suitably sized fire evacuation lift. What's a core? Here's a general arrangement drawing of a building we're working on in London at the moment. So the green boxes are stairs. So we've got 4 of them. The purple boxes are passenger lifts. So I've got 5 of them. Yeah, I've got a red core there that's firefighter core. And I've got 3 goods lift cores. That's 13 cores. So should I have 13 evacuation lifts? Surely not. But it's not clear. And it may be that, core in the world of lifts, we think of in a slightly different way to maybe the drafters of the London Plan, but it needs to be clearer. My sense is it's probably related to stair core, as stairs are related to evacuation, but it's not clear. And in my opinion, it needs to be clearer. And then it uses this rather unhelpful term, and this plays back to some of the comments that Nick Mellor made just now in his presentation, that as an industry, we need to be more precise with our words, particularly when we're talking about the functionality of various different types of lifts. So the London Plan uses this word fire evacuation lift. So what the hell's that? Is it a firefighting lift? Is it a firefighters lift? Is it an evacuation lift? We really don't know. And how would I design a fire evacuation lift, and how would I commission it? We've got Part 72, as a designated standard post-Brexit for design of firefighters lifts. We understand that as an industry, but the London Plan's not saying a firefighters lift, it's saying a fire evacuation lift. So is it an evacuation lift to 4 nines? Might be. Or is it an evacuation lift to the current 391? Which is a residential application, which then refers back to 4 nines. So I think, to my mind, there's 4 words there: core, fire evacuation lift, that cause confusion and doubt, which need to be resolved. Other elements of the London Plan. So it talks about here a general scene setting as well, but now the last piece here that's highlighted starts to give us a bit more direction as to where we need to go and look to try to understand a bit more about what it is intending. So it talks about fire evacuation lifts and associated provisions should be designed, constructed, and include controls suitable for the purposes intended. And it then says to go and see policy D12, fire safety. So this then creates another issue, in my opinion. So we have the London Plan, which is a formally published document, published in March 2021. But unfortunately, the London Plan itself then makes reference to additional guidance documents. So that's fantastic. We've got some guidance that helps us interpret the intent of the London Plan. Unfortunately, though, at the moment, these guidance documents are draft documents and are pre-consultation. So the text from beneath this picture here is directly taken from the London website, london.gov.uk's website. So we've got a formal guidance document called the London Plan. It says go and look at these guidance documents to help interpret the London Plan, but they're draft. So when we look at this draft document, we see here within policy D12, so this is the overarching fire strategy document. Item 5 here, it talks about where lifts are proposed, has the author of this fire safety strategy declared compliance against the London Plan requirement for fire evacuation lifts. And it references D5B5. So it's saying, okay, I've got to comply to this fire safety strategy, but in order to do that, I've got to make a declaration I comply to the requirement for evac lifts. And the requirement for evac lifts is in this policy D5B5. So if we look at D5B5, which still is a draft document, this is the intent, you can clearly see the intent of it is to provide a methodology for applicants and planning officers to use, and provides additional guidance and context on evacuation lifts to enable a greater understanding of the subject during the planning process. So clearly it's a key document, and if we as an industry are going to respond to the requirements of the London Plan, we need to understand this, because this is going to be the guidance that planning officers use to guide their decision-making process. It contains a bit more information here. So it says an evacuation lift. Now, I may be being a bit pedantic here, but up till now, we've talked about fire evacuation lifts, and now we're talking about evacuation lifts. So I've got the London Plan that says go and put a fire evacuation lift in, but then the guidance says evacuation lift. We've lost the word fire. It talks item 6 there, an evac lift is a lift that's been specifically designed to be used in an evacuation situation. And it talks then about automatic modes, which picks up some of the comments that Nick was talking about earlier, and the general direction of travel of BS 391, which is helpful. I guess there's a certain alignment there between the London Plan's expectations in terms of an evacuation lift's functionality and the direction of travel that we're going in with BS 991, albeit, as Nick said, 991 has a lot of hurdles to jump over yet before it gets to a published status, as indeed does Part 76. But London Plan seems to be talking about some form of automatic mode. Item 8 is interesting because it also talks about evacuation lifts being provided in addition to any building reg requirement for firefighting lifts. So again, maybe being pedantic, but that should say firefighters lifts, because a new building does not have firefighting lifts in it. It has firefighters lifts in it. But it talks about that they're provided in addition so that they can be used for evacuation purposes when the firefighters lift is in use by the fire and rescue service. So this starts to talk a little bit differently to one of the slides that Farouk showed us earlier that talked about from a fire engineer's perspective. There may well be scenarios where a firefighter's lift could also be an evacuation lift, and historically, that has been the typical provision, because of course the firefighter's lift naturally has secondary power supply. Naturally, it sits in a protected core. It has a comms system on it anyway. Okay, it needs enhancement to deal with evacuation comms, but the firefighter's lift naturally has a lot of the fundamental requirements of an evacuation lift, and therefore is a natural candidate to be an evac lift. But the London Plan here seems to suggest no, it can't be or shouldn't be the same lift as a firefighter's lift. The document provides a checklist, which I don't intend going down, but you can see the highlighted item about halfway down on the graphic on the right, talks about a declaration of compliance. And this appears to be a formal document whereby the applicant, the person declaring compliance with the London Plan, needs to confirm compliance with the evacuation lift requirements. And this declaration of compliance is a statement written and signed by the author confirming that the technical content produced within their application complies with all relevant legislation and London Plan fire safety policy. So it's clearly a very important document, but the evac lift piece is clearly a key piece to it. So this again, just a bit more detail on the declaration of compliance. And it starts also in that final piece to start talking about, it's not just the evac lift itself, but it's the method of management and maintenance, and indeed the I guess emergency evacuation procedures that need to go with it, that need to be thought about in some detail. The policy also then talks about specific applications. And in the back of the document, there's Appendix A, which recognises a residential scenario as being particularly of interest. And I guess it comes back to the discussion that we were having earlier, or the point that Nick was making, that in certain buildings, there may not be any on-site management. And that is typically in residential buildings. It's more likely in residential buildings, I would suggest, than it is in a commercial workplace type building where you've naturally got maybe facilities management teams on site. And this idea that if you don't have a competent person able to use the evacuation lift in the driver assisted mode, then you must have some other alternative. And it talks about, again, making reference to this automatic evacuation mode, or indeed the remote assisted evacuation mode. So now we have the London Plan proposing a remote evacuation mode, which is particularly problematic, or has been shown to be particularly problematic when proposed by EN 81 Part 76. So again, we've got a potential conflict there. And then we come to this document. This is Appendix B, and this was the one that caused issues as well. And you can see down the bottom the relevant British standard. Now, when this draft document was first issued, it did not have the when published or the reference to 391 or the reference to 49s. It simply said evacuation lists must comply to BSEN 8176. And it was that in many ways was the red flag when we did kind of uncover the London Plan that initiated the initial consultation that Lear had and SIBSI had to the GLA to say, look, we understand this is a draft document, but it's simply not deliverable because it's referencing a British standard that simply does not exist and may never exist. And if it does exist, is some years away. So that generated this change that now says, OK, Part 76 when published, but until if it isn't published, then it needs to be to 391s or BS 49s. So I think we understand that it's a stepping stone. At least we've got a reference there to some established standards. Obviously 9991 refers to BS 49s in terms of how to design an evacuation lift. So it's actually saying your evac lift should comply to BS 49s. Looking at the words on the left-hand side, again, it's quite good in as much as it says evacuation lifts should not be misinterpreted as firefighters lifts, it should say. I think it needs a bit more detail, a bit more precision in understanding that, are they really saying they must always be different? And it does also talk about in the key features of the evacuation lift from a London Plan perspective. But of course, in my mind, one of the key things that isn't in that key features that is in BS 49s is this clause here extracted, which talks about an evacuation lift being situated within a protected enclosure. So this is one of the reasons why a firefighter's lift was often a good candidate to be an evacuation lift, because it was naturally in a protected enclosure. But the London Plan seems to be saying, no, they shouldn't be firefighters' lifts because they're needed to fight the fire, not to evacuate people. And this idea that you might actually make a passenger lift in a regular passenger lift group in an office, an evacuation lift. Well, yes, we could give it secondary power, not too much of a problem. We could give it the comms systems, though I don't think the architects will be particularly pleased having a somewhat ugly comms panel existing on every single floor in their front of house lobby, but it could be done. But the protected core is a bit more of a challenge in a workplace environment, maybe not so much in a residential where typically the lift lobby is a protected lobby anyway, but in a workplace environment. So now we've got a struggle here that the London Plan is saying you need evacuation lifts, you need one per core. Now, we're not sure what a core is, but say it's a stair core. So for every stair core, we need an evacuation lift. It shouldn't be a firefighter's lift. Therefore, we might look at the goods lifts, or we might look at the passenger lifts, but those are less likely to be running in a protected core. But the London Plan says I must comply to BS 49s. Well, how can I comply to BS49s when that says protected enclosure? So I think there's some fundamental issues to resolve here. Yeah, they're not red flags, but I think we need to work together as an industry with the GLA to try to drive in some more precision to try and resolve these issues. From my perspective, I think the guidance documents on how to comply with the London Plan remain as pre-consultation drafts, which is problematic, and that they're not sufficiently precise in their language with respect to lift provision. And I think that those documents require further input from the lift industry prior to their publication in final form. And as I mentioned earlier, we're aware that the lobbying of the GLA is underway through bodies such as LEA, CIBSE and BSI. But chatting to Nick Mellor earlier in the week, I think he's nudging them regularly, but hasn't had that engagement yet. But clearly the documents that exist on the web are clearly pre-consultation drafts. So there will be a period of consultation. I guess as an industry, we've just got to make sure we're not caught out by surprise again. And my point 3 there, I think, and again, it's easy to say, and I know as we all come off this call, we'll go back to the real world and our emails and clients and demands. But as an industry, looking in hindsight at this document, yeah, it's an example, where that we ought to use as encouragement for us all to strive harder to make sufficient time to comment on these drafts. It would have been out there, the London Plan. And I guess you can't spend all your time looking for these documents, but when they do appear, when new standards appear, when things like this appear that do affect the industry, we as an industry, I think, need to find the time to go through them and try to craft them and influence them so that they don't create the issues that this document's creating. I think I'd encourage anybody on this call to go to the web. You can see the website address where you can download the London Plan. It's a free to download document. You can obviously search electronically for the word lift, so get all the context that we've touched on in this talk. The draft guidance documents are available to download. And I'm more than happy, with my CIBSE Lifts Group codes and standards hat on to act as a portal for any comments that anybody would like to submit. And then as part of the CIBSE Lifts Group, under their banner, we could submit those comments either directly to the GLA or work with Nick Mellor and the LEA team to submit through LEA. I think there's a real opportunity here. In the meantime, my thoughts are that as a lift industry, we should be very focused on the fact that we provide lifts. We're not fire engineers. We can't determine how many evacuation lifts you need, where they are, how big they are. What we can do is design an evacuation lift when asked to. So I think as an industry at the moment, we should be looking to the author of this declaration of compliance, which to my understanding is typically owned by the project fire engineer, particularly on larger projects. And it's that document that should be telling us what the project specific requirements are for firefighters lifts and evacuation lifts, quantity, location, size, features, because the sense from that London Plan is that your management plan for evacuation will be project specific. And so the features that you have on one evac lift may not be the same as on another evac lift. And I think as an industry, when we're tendering, we need to clarify very precisely which design standards or codes of practice the equipment is intended to be designed and commissioned to. And this is this issue to try to avoid. We've had examples in London where we've had fire strategies that call for firefighters lifts, but they're not in a protected core. So we're then engaging in a discussion that says, well, we can't commission that lift to BS EN 8172 if it's not in a protected core. So what would you like us to commission it to? Because it's not a firefighter's lift as defined by Part 72. So I think, again, it's about precision for us as an industry in understanding what it is that's intended by the competent people. In other words, the authors of those declarations of compliance.